Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Deborah Wang, Artistic Director of DesignTO. DesignTO is a nonprofit arts organization that is best known for its annual Design Festival. This year's festival takes place across Toronto, distanced and digitally, from January 22nd to 31st, 2021. DesignTO would like to acknowledge that the land we are on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As well, DesignTO would like to draw attention to the land defenders of 1492 Land Back Lane, a Six Nations group who are defending their legal treaty rights to land in Caledonia, Ontario, along the Grand River near Hamilton, from ongoing development by Foxgate Developments. You can donate to their GoFundMe campaign for legal funds, which has already raised half of their $500,000 goal. You can find the URL in the chat. The Archive, the Glyph, and the City is a celebration of the DesignTO Awards presented by Herman Miller. This three-part event celebrates the 2020 awardees through a deeper dive into 3 distinct projects and practices, but you can learn more about all the projects at designto.org/awards. The online event will be recorded. It will run for approximately an hour and 15 minutes, including a short Q&A period with Amy Auscherman. Audience questions can be submitted through the chat. Part 1. In the archive, we will take a virtual visit to the Herman Miller Archives and learn how the company uses its history to inform the present and the future. Amy Auscherman, Head of Archives and Brand Heritage at Herman Miller, will share the ways the corporate archive is used, from product development to brand marketing, and how designers like Charles and Ray Eames and Alexander Girard documented their own design processes. Welcome, Amy.
Can you guys see my presentation? All good? Thank you so much for having me, Deborah. Herman Miller Canada has been part of the DesignTO Awards program since 2013. So for the past 8 years, this has been a very natural and amazing partnership. And I'm really honored to be able to be here and share a little bit about my work with Herman Miller. I'm coming to you live from the archives here in West Michigan. Herman Miller has been in Canada since 1966, so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of company history tonight, but also I'm usually taking people through the archives in real life, so I'm going to do that virtually tonight with you all, kind of talk a little bit about my work and how we use this amazing resource at Herman Miller, and maybe hopefully provide some inspiration for the designers and other practitioners on the call to think about how they're documenting their own work and stories and the many stories in design. So without further ado, here is an image of the warehouse space that I in fact manage and that I'm sitting in right now. So Herman Miller has been accumulating an archive since its founding really in 1905, but the archive became a more official part of business in the 1980s. And so what you see here are documents of the design process and also records that are generated during business. So there are things like architectural drawings and market launch plans and photography. And you're going to see a little bit in my presentation tonight of this type of stuff that we've kept over the years. I think one of my favorite things that we've ever come across in the archive is this letter from George Nelson to Herman Miller founder DJ Dupree. So George Nelson was sort of our first design director, creative director. I think he was a brand marketer before that was even considered a practice. But George Nelson was actually the one responsible for getting Herman Miller to get the Eameses on board. Charles and Ray Eames had been perfecting their 3D plywood molding process since the early 40s. And by the time that, World War II was over, someone like George Nelson saw the seating that the Eameses had been working on and thought that it would be a good addition to the line of furniture that Nelson himself was designing for Herman Miller. The Eameses at this point were already sort of famous within the design world for their experiments with molded plywood, but along with letters like that sort of clarifies when this relationship began comes stuff like this, which is one of the many patents that Herman Miller has, one of the first by Charles Eames. And so a document like this in our archive is not only useful for our legal team at some points, but I mean, this is a really amazing image and fun to see. So it's as simple as also putting it on our social media for marketing purposes. One of my favorite collections that we have in the archives is one that documents our product development process. Herman Miller had what we called a model shop that was headed up by a guy named Pep Nagelkirk. And so Pep's job was to sort of be the intermediary between these design firms like George Nelson and the Eameses, Alexander Girard. And it was the guy in-house at Herman Miller that was figuring out how to make this stuff in mass. And so this particular folder is for a product that never came to pass. And it was a high-backed version of George Nelson's kind of now iconic coconut chair. And so I can imagine at some point, a business guy here in West Michigan was thinking, maybe we need to make this a little bit more of a lounge shape. And so they did some experiments, but after a few tries, they did not end up moving forward with the design. And here are some examples or reasons why. And I love this kind of documentation because not only is it funny to sort of read back with this acerbic and very dry take. But this sort of communication now happens over a Slack message or an email or a text. And so I guess I'm a bit nostalgic for the ways that we would have to communicate in interoffice mail. But also this kind of provides a nice, provides some reason for me if a creative director ever comes back and thinks, hey, should we try a different profile of the coconut chair? And the answer is no, and here's why. We also have a huge film collection at Herman Miller. So Charles and Ray Eames were prolific filmmakers, and some of their earliest films that they did were for Herman Miller and were effectively product films, commercials, but really delved into the design process, how these products were put together. So Charles and Ray, when the chair was done and it was in the production line, they still weren't done with the products. They also wanted to have a say in how they were marketed and talked about as well. We also have a huge photography collection at Herman Miller that consists of prints, negatives, slides, stuff that has been accumulated over our history. We have moments like this. This is Alexander Girard and his wife and business partner, Susan. Girard was the head of Herman Miller's textile division, but also did the design of our San Francisco showroom that opened in the late 50s. And this was a snapshot by their friends, Charles and Ray Eames, at presumably the opening party. But I just love imagining what this opening party would have been like. And then we also get art direction or evidence of art direction by the Eames office in our photo collection. So you see this image where this could very easily be chairs around a table, very boring, but instead it has movement. You have some of Ray Eames's amazing floral designs there in the right, but Ray Eames was also sort of like a product stylist before that was a thing. So I like seeing elements of her creative process in these images as well. This was a photo that was made for the launch of the molded plywood furniture group that I showed you the patent for. But again, from an art direction standpoint, you look at this and it's not immediately clear that this is just, in fact, a room full of furniture, but instead this sort of looks like a constructivist multimedia piece of art, but this is just Eameses doing what they do best, which is elevating every experience. We also have a group of photography in the archive from a photographer named Ezra Stoller, who was kind of effectively the most famous architectural photographer working in the late 40s, 50s, 60s. And this is an image that he made of Isamu Noguchi's glass top coffee table. So I love that you also get from Stoller here. I mean, he's usually photographing buildings, but instead he's taken that lens and turned it on a table and rendering it as architecture itself. And I love that you sort of disassociate what this thing is because of the image. It's like, is this a spaceship? No, it's purely a coffee table. Another one of my favorite collections in the archives, there was a gentleman named Jim Eppinger, who is Herman Miller's first East Coast sales representative and was also a liaison between these early designers. So this is Alexander Girard at his home in Santa Fe, pictured with some of his folk art collection. I love this. This was probably a rare moment when Charles and Ray Eames, Alexander Girard, and George Nelson were all in the same room. Nelson was based in New York City, the Eameses in California, and Girard in Santa Fe. So I imagine this was at some sort of Herman Miller sales event. And then I love this image of Ray and Charles in their home in the Pacific Palisades, just having a quiet moment. But then I also think about Jim, who was taking these pictures and got to go spend time with these very interesting, prolific people in their own spaces. So since you guys can't physically be here tonight, this is a view inside of our vault. So within that warehouse space, we do have a smaller temperature controlled area where we keep things like film negatives and some of this earlier furniture. So some more pictures of boxes that make me look very organized. In the vault, we keep some of the earlier examples of Eames and other designs. So I like this image here because if you look at the bases on the middle chair and the chair to the right, you can very much see the Eames's design process in action. The chair on the right is earlier, and you see sort of this flared out foot. That then in the chair on the left, it's sort of more upright. So the chair on the right is earlier. Those feet failed in the sitting process. And so Charles and Ray very quickly kind of refined their design, saw where it was breaking down, and very quickly kind of refined the design. But you can see how they were constantly iterating. And also, I get a lot of questions in my job. How can I tell how old my piece of furniture is? And sometimes it's as simple as flipping it over and looking at the product marking. So Herman Miller initially was the distributor of Eames furniture. It was manufactured by a company called Evans, based out of Washington. So this label tells me that this chair comes from anywhere between 1947 and 1949, before Herman Miller took on the Eames furniture solely and acquired the technology as well. So another view of the vault and the flat files. And in those flat files, we have tons of textile samples. So Girard designed over 300 textiles in a multitude of colorways during his time at Herman Miller. And we've kept a lot of those samples that are now used by our textile company that's part of Herman Miller's family, Maharam. So we also have drawings from the design process that, for example, on the right, every single component of an Eames lounge chair and ottoman, and on the left, a final drawing for the Eames walnut stools. I love seeing all of the notes and stuff that has been added or subtracted from the designs over the years, and it's actually super helpful for our product team as we continue to manufacture these designs and see what has changed over the years. So it's really easy for me in my job to talk about people like the Eameses, George Nelson, Alexander Girard, sort of people that have already been committed to the design history canon. But a favorite part of my job is sort of seeking out the people's stories who maybe haven't been told. And so the woman on the left, she's a Japanese American designer named Tomoko Miho, who worked for George Nelson's office and actually headed up his graphic design division. And if you're a Herman Miller graphic design history nerd, she's actually the person responsible for some of the more iconic graphic pieces that came out of the Nelson office, including the catalog that you see here on the right, which is Herman Miller's 1964 catalog, and sort of set the precedent for furniture catalogs coming in binder form, which if you're a part of our industry is sort of how everybody does them now. So Tomoko was not only responsible for the layout, but she was doing art direction on some of these photo shoots as well. So I love that she takes something that could be as boring as school seating and turns it into fine art and sculpture by just simply stacking it. Here are some later 60s catalogs that she did as well. I love her sense of color. We just have a huge advertising collection at Herman Miller. Thankfully, we kind of cut out every single thing that was appearing in trade publications over the years. A guy named Irving Harper that worked for George Nelson actually designed our logo, which is an M that we still use today. Another favorite part of my collection, I have a lot, is our clippings file. So for example, this was an advertisement for the Noguchi coffee table that appeared in an October 1949 issue of the New Yorker. So it's really interesting to see where this stuff was showing up. And I'm just very grateful that it got saved. And I always like to shout out a lot of the archival labor was done early on by what we would think of as administrative assistants. So the people who were facilitating business for executives, other leaders, those were the people who were making sure the stuff was saved and sort of documenting the process and deciding what gets saved. So I like to shout out that labor that doesn't really get highlighted very often in the process. So some more advertisements. Irving Harper, who did a lot of these, loved designing for Herman Miller because he could make the furniture as small as he wanted it on the page. I love this one where he's taking wood species and furniture poles and rendering it into a mask. So something that could be pretty boring, but making it fun. More eye candy by Harper. Alexander Girard got in on some of the graphic design as well. He loved making his own typefaces. So this was some that he did for the San Francisco showroom that you saw him in earlier. A sales mailer that he designed as well. I just love his typography. So a kind of a small story about a very one-to-one example of how the archives are used. So a few years ago, we needed to expand. We needed another bed to add to the line. And so our product developers, creative directors came to the archives to do research to see if there was something from our past that we could revive. And in fact, George Nelson's thin edge bed group and day bed were two viable options. So they came to the archives. We found the drawings, those original product development files that Pep Nagelkirk had kept, the details, and we were able to add these products back to our product line. So the drawing that you see on the left is from when the bed was first introduced, and then on the right is some of our newer product photography. Another very one-to-one version of the day bed. And then, you know, I'm kind of nose to tail with every process. So, you know, product development comes to me when we're first thinking of this, and then PR comes to me at the end asking if we have stories, photography, assets to sort of recontextualize and reintroduce people to this product and story of the product. So I have to plug this giant Herman Miller monograph that we finished about a year ago. It's been out now. So it's history of the company where we're drawing from sort of our own corporate archive that I've taken you through. But we tell stories in it, like how our logo has shown itself in our physical spaces and through environmental graphics over the years. So you look at this page and we have material on here from Herman Miller's own archive, but also the Museum of Modern Art, the Library of Congress, the list goes on. It was the first time that we were able to put a lot of this graphic work all in one place and sort of show people. I mean, unless you were a Herman Miller customer or working in our showrooms, or you collected this stuff later on, you never really get to see all this stuff in one place. I also got to do so much primary source research for this project, which was a dream. But then we also used the book as a chance to republish the designers in their own words. So instead of reading our interpretation, you can actually just read Alexander Girard's own essay, Good Design versus Style, that originally appeared in a magazine called Furniture Forum. And the book is also kind of ties our past to now. I kind of joke that my job as Herman Miller's archivist or head of archives is that I connect our past, present, and future. And so the book itself, this is a look at our more recent retail store in New York City, where when we were designing the inside of the space, which I was a part of, we were looking at examples from Girard, from the Eameses, from Nelson to sort of inspire how we're merchandising today. And to sort of get you guys thinking, if you are a designer, graphic designer, industrial designer, how greats like the Eameses were documenting their own process, because they very much did, almost obsessively. In the research process for this book, I got to go to the Library of Congress. You do, in fact, need a library card for this. So this is me in the reading room. But Charles and Ray Eames, after they passed away, donated over 1 million items to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. It's split between the manuscript division and the prints and photographs. So on the left, you have a manuscript box. On the right, I went through tens of thousands of color slides, which you see on the right, that we were able to source a lot of color images for the book. But in the manuscript division, you had stuff like this. This was a sketch that was likely done within the Eames office that is instructions and assembly hardware for the Eames molded fiberglass chairs. So I just imagine that this got mocked up in the Eames office, sent over to Herman Miller so that the people working here knew how to put this stuff together. I also love stuff like this. So again, Ray was styling the photo shoots, helping design the Eames lounge and ottoman, and then she was also doing color studies for invites to the Herman Miller showroom. So this is sort of a mock-up for an invite to Herman Miller's LA showroom. The Eameses also kept their own press. I love this. So Saul Steinberg was a close friend of the Eameses. He's an illustrator for The New Yorker. And shortly after the Eameses finished their molded fiberglass chairs, they had Saul come over and do some drawings on one that included this, sitting nude. And is it vulgar or is it art? So I just love thinking about Ray and Charles keeping this press about themselves. And then a more surreal part of the research process, like sitting in the Library of Congress reading room, I opened up a folder and literally it's just this pile, these scraps of paper, and was very confused at first. But then I remembered that Ray Eames collected a lot of decorative paper, and what sort of arrived in my head was that this was a color study that Ray was doing, likely, because you look at these colors all together, they look very perfect. So I love that this was sitting on her desk, it got boxed up, and now lives permanently in the largest library in the world. And then I talked a little bit about the slide collection, but this is the last slide. This is Ray Eames sitting outside of her home in Pacific Palisades. And then also, it's a nice moment, but I just love kind of seeing too all of the call numbers for the Library of Congress and just showing how much documentation goes into saving this stuff, so that maybe it can be inspiration for how you all might do it. But that's it. And I'm going to end this and go back to Deborah.
Thanks, Amy.
Yay.
For that kind of whirlwind tour of the archives through your slideshow, and I can see that you're sitting in place.
Literally in here. I have a slide camera behind me.
You're coming to us live from the place where it all happens.
Yes.
So maybe I'll just start with a really simple question, which is, it seems like, at least from your presentation, I mean, the things that you got to go through, and thank you for taking us through like memos and, all the creative photo shoots and the untold stories, as you mentioned. And I was thinking, like, how did you get this amazing job,
I pinch myself sometimes. I studied art history and library science. And before Herman Miller, I worked for the Indianapolis Museum of Art in Indiana. And I digitized an architectural archive that was that went with the Miller House and Garden in Columbus, Indiana, which was a home designed by Eero Saarinen, Alexander Girard. The Eameses did some custom furniture for it. Dan Kiley did the landscape design. So it was an amazing sort of design education in the form of a multimedia archive that kind of mirrors the type of stuff that's in here. Because when I was in library school, I was with a lot of people that were probably expecting to be like medievalists or like really into Shakespeare first folios, but I was really into like art books and process and design archives were something that I hadn't even considered, but when I worked with the Miller House collection, there were textile samples, design drawings, correspondence between client and the designers. So it was just mind-blowing. And I did, I kept a Tumblr blog for that project. It was a National Endowment for the Humanities funded project, and part of the stipulation was to document your process. And so Tumblr was hot on the scene for design, for libraries and museums, and we ended up just sharing. I'm kind of like just what I went through, which is like cool stuff that you need a little context for, and then it's, you know, inspiring or lends itself to helping you understand how something came to be. And I got recruited for this job here at Herman Miller. I still can't believe that it's an actual job, but I think I'm just the weirdo for it. That has the subject matter interest.
That's so perfect. I have another question, but I know there are some lined up, so I'm going to go there,
Okay.
and we'll hear from our audience. So the question is, are the archives being digitized?
Yes, and actually, I'm not in my office every day. I've been working at home mostly, and these COVID times, and I think a lot of archivists and librarians will say it's been a good time to sort of get some housekeeping done. And so we're actually in the process of populating. I'm doing a big dam project, so document asset management system. We're focusing on getting the stuff that we do have digitized, because we digitized a lot for the book, and then also getting like our metadata cleaned up. So my dream is to have a public facing digital archive at some point, but we're sort of laying the groundwork for that now. I think it's really unique that a corporate entity has this sort of design archive, that after having the privilege to gone to the Library of Congress and to the Cooper Hewitt and MoMA, I would say Herman Miller's documentation of American modern design is pretty extensive. And so I have the pleasure of trying to figure out how to share this material that's not only really helpful to the business, but share it with design fans. Like I'm a fan of the stuff, and I know other people would be, so that's my dream.
Amazing. Next question. How many years were you working on the book for? It's a thick one, so I'm going to say a lot, and I know how arduous it is to get all the image reproduction rights and credits and et cetera, et cetera.
That was my distinct pleasure of like crash course in rights and reproduction. It took about 4 years, a little over 4 years. So that was all of the we could have kept doing research forever. And I did this with two co-authors, Sam Graw and Leon Ransmeyer. It took a village. Anybody who's ever made a book, like it takes a lot of people to do it. And it could have kept going. There's so much good stuff. I feel like we could have made 10 books, to be quite honest.
And as you were gathering then for the book, like did the form of the book change? Like I imagine over a 4-year period, as you're kind of collecting things and maybe having access to some things you weren't expecting and not having access potentially and not getting those rights, like how did that inform the shape of the book?
Well, thankfully, we pretty much could. So much came from our own archive, which was super helpful. And we work closely with the Eames office. But I think the biggest challenge was to have Herman Miller's story, like tell it in a way that's relevant to somebody who doesn't work here. It's an amazing story. But I think Herman Miller has affected and been a part of pop culture in such a way that, like, even if you don't know who designed an Eames lounge chair and ottoman or a molded plywood chair or a fiberglass shell chair, like you've seen it, you recognize it. I think Herman Miller furniture has entered into like visual culture in a way that people recognize it even if they don't know what it is. So it was important for me to be like getting people like, here's Muhammad Ali in an Eames lounge and ottoman, because that was his favorite chair. Like, here's Barack Obama writing the State of the Union. So kind of showing those pop culture moments. Actually, the hardest image to get in the book was a still from The Simpsons where God is sitting in an Aeron chair. So now I know how to license a still from The Simpsons.
Amazing. think we're going to have a couple more questions. Okay, the question is, how is Herman Miller archiving current design work?
Hey, Vince, that is coming from somebody who has their own design archive. I am actively involved in all of the design projects that are happening now. And so we're kind of involved at the outset of every project. And then I'm kind of keeping up with project managers along the way, the designers themselves, and sort of like encouraging people to self-archive, because people will ask me like, well, what do I say from the design process? And my answer is like, well, what are your aha moments? Like, you know, the process, you know, what's important. And also you kind of have to get a bit of an ego about it. Like, what is the story that you want told about, you know, whether it's a product design, a GIF, or an animation. The Eameses did it. I mean, I told you guys, they sent over 1 million things to the Library of Congress, which like is sort of out of this world on one hand. And when you're with it, you're like, I can't believe people saved all this stuff. But that's also how I went back and looked through it. And there's much more to be told from it, but you kind of have to tell your own story a little bit and make those decisions along the way. So I try to be there at every step of the way. But there's two, it's me and my colleague, Alexa Hagan. There's only 2 of us. So we try to prioritize how we can.
Amazing. And one more question. Do you have a favorite piece in the archive?
It's like if you have children, somebody asks you your favorite child. My favorite thing is that it exists at all. I'm really, I'm glad I have a job, and a very unique one. But I think Herman Miller and the leaders along the way having the foresight to save this stuff. And then sometimes they didn't. I have a memo or a group of documents from Herman Miller's founder, DJ Dupree, and it was a group of documents that the first letter I showed you, and DJ had saved all of the early correspondence between George Nelson and himself about Nelson being hired for Herman Miller. Like, history being made, and you have the memos where it's happening. And DJ, when he retired, gave it to the archives, but with a note on top that said, I kept this for sentimental reasons, not sure if it really has any value, feel free to get rid of it. And like, thank God they didn't, because it literally, I mean, it's right there. So I'm just glad that this stuff got saved at all. We do have a really cool Alexander Girard love seat in the vault that I like as well.
That maybe you're lounging on clandestinely?
Of course not.
Thank you so much, Amy. This was a great presentation and introduction to the archives. Thank you for joining us all the way from Michigan.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to hear everyone else too. Thank you.
So on to part 2, and please everyone keep the questions coming on the chat. We will have time for a couple questions in each part. And now we're going to part 2, which is the Glyph, where designer and professor Mia Cinelli and arts manager Anahita Rahimi will discuss Mia's typographic work that won Best in Festival for New Work at the DesignTO Festival earlier this year. They will cover Mia's hybrid practice and speculative design, as well as the process of creating her glyphs that capture human emotions and gestures. Welcome, Mia and Anahita.
Hi. Hello. Hi there. Hi. How's it going? It's going well, thanks. I'm so excited to be here. This is great. Me too. That's awesome. It's great that we had a chance to meet a little bit before. So we can just get started. First of all, congratulations for winning Best New Work in the festival, in Canada's leading design festival. It must have been really exciting.
It was wild. I have to tell you, I totally didn't expect it. And it was such a humbling experience because I felt really fortunate that I was able to attend DesignTO and see the amazing exhibitions and incredible work. And so I was unbelievably flattered that my work was chosen because there was such incredible work all across the festival and such great exhibitions and events. So it was really a joy to be a part of.
That's awesome. So you came up and saw the whole festival last year.
I did. It was really great. I was lucky to be a part of 2 different exhibitions. And so that was really fun to see multiple approaches and to see like the expanded field of art and design, which I thought was really wonderful and incredibly refreshing.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal festival, and I was also honored to be part of the jury and with a group of really amazing colleagues to go through all the submissions and all the works. And it was a fun day too, because, you know, we drove in a van, 7 of us cooped up in a van, exchanged notes, giggles, sharing a tight space. Good old days, you know. Anyways, so let's get into tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and before we get into the exhibition that you had at DesignTO.
Sure. Well, my name is Mia. I currently am a designer and educator and artist. I teach art and design at the University of Kentucky in the School of Art and Visual Studies, and my work is rooted in typography and product design and experiences and graphic design. And I think of myself as being a designer of experiences and interactions, because I'm really interested in what design can do on an experience level and on an emotional level, and the great power that it has to have meaningful impact on people's lives.
So you're kind of like defining yourself more as a designer and also working in the intersection of art and design. So how would you kind of like have a distinction between the two? When would you consider yourself a designer, and when would you consider yourself an artist?
Oh, that's a really good and a really difficult question, because I think for me, I would think that it's kind of both all the time, but I think it depends on intent and what I'm kind of trying to do. So thinking about, you know, if you're doing client work and you know you're doing a graphic identity, like that requires a certain, you know, number of decisions that are being made from point A to point B. And then sometimes you have, you know, the realm of design authorship where you're still moving from point A to point B, but instead of, say, formatting content, you're creating content, and you're thinking about, what am I trying to do here, and what am I trying to say? And so, while I think of myself as a designer all the time, I think of myself as an artist all the time too, in the same way that, you know, when you put together, say, an exhibition, you're still thinking about the pragmatics of it. You're thinking about how someone moves through the space and what they see first and how they learn. But then, of course, there's the poetics of it. There's, what does someone get from this? What is the audience experience? And what is my intent? And what do I have to say as an artist and as a creative person? And so for me, I'm bringing the same skills to the table every time. And still, you know, it's still play, it's still visual communication, it's still ideating through. And so there's a designer I admire named Brock Davis who says, not every medium is appropriate to every idea, which I really love, because it's a nice way of thinking through that I can approach each different task and each different project in its own way.
And where do you usually feel the pull, to your artistic side or your designer side?
Oh my goodness. Depends on the season, maybe. Right now, I'm doing a lot of, you know, like self-directed kind of things. And sometimes there are this might sound a little bit hokey, but sometimes I find in making art and in, you know, design authorship that you have experiences that you hold on to and you carry them around for a while. And then the only way to set them down is to make work about it. And then you've set them down, and then you can be removed from them again. And then you can see them and you can experience it and you can move on. And so, yeah. I don't know if that answers very well.
No, I totally get what you're saying. It's kind of like the idea develops in the back of your head, and it kind of like steeps, right? It just like you sit on it, and it until you create it and you give it life and it's born, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
I totally understand that. So the work that you had, it was called what was it was for Future Retrospective, and it was in response to this question, what will the future look like, and how did you get there? So how did you respond to that question with your work? I mean, right now, nobody predicted this type of a future we're in, right? But what was going on in your head? Like, how did you design that the work for this?
Sure, that's a great question. So speculative characters for visual inflection was something that I started thinking about 2 years ago. And these are a series of new typographic characters to better encapsulate gesture and metaphor and expression into our typographic lives and our written communication. And so this is one of those like rare ideas that kind of came to me like out of nowhere, where after a really long day of teaching type and making type, I had like sat down on the couch next to my husband and I had just gone, and he had gone, well, you know, that's a heavy sigh. And normally like that wouldn't have been like a really remarkable observation, except in that moment, I was like, a heavy sigh, like a heavy designates the weight of the sigh, but also the weight of a typeface. So like, what would a semi-bold sigh look like? And then why don't we have a character for this? And why don't we have characters for all of these kind of nonverbal communications? And so that really started the ball rolling. And so I percolated on this, honestly, probably for about a year, because I had other research obligations that I kind of needed, you know, to move through. And I was working with a local gallery in Lexington, Kentucky, where I live. And I had been thinking about it. And I talked to the curators and said, originally, I have this idea about typography. Are you okay putting this in your gallery? And they said, yeah. And so it started with a solo exhibition, and that gave me the impetus to make the work. And then when I saw the call for future retrospectives, I was absolutely elated, because I thought, this is a great place. This would be, you know, a great place to show this work and to talk about what we imagine the future could be through art and design.
Right. And I remember like looking at the characters, there was this quality of them that was very familiar. It's just kind of like, you know, it's obviously, you know, imaginative, but it felt familiar, something that you kind of know it. And it had a very sophisticated sense of humor. And I had a few favorite ones. I think one was the awkward pause, right? And I'm like, I was just like wondering, how would you go through designing that? Like the process, like, how do you capture that moment in a symbol? Like it's an emotion, right? It's really, yeah. And also the you know, the shrug or the awkward pause or the cringe moment, that was like really phenomenal. And I'm like, yeah.
That's a great question. So I started first by thinking about the nonverbal, you know, gestures that we use and facial expressions that we use, because we know that so much of our communication is nonverbal. Like we can make a face and someone knows what we mean. And I started thinking about places where we were interjecting this in our normal conversation where we didn't have a place for that. And of course that happens through emoticons. And then of course, more notably and more recently, emojis. And I love emojis. Like I use them all the time, but then some of that problem is that they lack a certain formality. Like they're hard to put in an email, right? And still sound really professional. And so part of that was thinking about what are our commonly used emojis? What are some really common facial expressions that are recognizable? And then what are perhaps more like culturally situated things that we use in conversation, like say like air quotes when we're doing something kind of mockingly, and how do we incorporate those gestures in a way other than putting them between asterisks in kind of typed lines? So as I was starting to develop them, a lot of it was actually like looking at gestures, photographing gestures, looking at facial expressions. That was really important, and starting to sketch those out in that way. I became very interested in the relationship between sound and shape. So something that I learned as I was designing was about the Kiki Booba effect. And the Kiki Booba effect is something that researchers have done, and they've repeated this experiment over and over, by which they show two shapes, and one is kind of a rounded blob, and the other is this like very spiky kind of shape. And they ask people which is Kiki and which is Booba. And Booba is always this rounded shape, and Kiki is always this really spiky one across languages. And that's really amazing, because it shows that the relationship between sound and shape is not arbitrary. And so things like the cringe mark had to feel sharp and like a wince in that way, or things like the disgust mark needed to feel a little bit like they were dripping in that kind of way. And there we go, Kiki Booba. And so, like this is, so that's like part of how that came to be. Other things that I was thinking about as I was designing them was like their context and feasibility. So I spent like kind of an embarrassing amount of time handwriting these out, and as I was developing them, because I thought, well, I don't want these to just be things that are, say, typed. like these would have to make sense if you were writing a quick note to go to the grocery store. Like you'd want to put this in if you're writing a note to someone, or if you were writing a note in a classroom, right? Like you'd want to be able to use these in line. And so I wanted to make sure that they were easy to write and made sense in that kind of context. Right. Other things I thought about were how they would live in context. So here's just like a scanned page from my notebook of trying to draw out, and these are very early drafts of things like, I think, the cringe mark. You can see cringe is kind of written there. I'm trying to figure out how this feels like a face, how it feels really scrunched, how it feels, kind of tight and defensive. And then thinking also about the context in which these live, and Helvetica as being one of the most commonly used typefaces of the 20th century, thinking that would be a really good place for that to exist. So that was kind of the framework that I gave myself of, okay, what if these existed within Helvetica? And so then it's just iterating through, and we all know in art and design that the first thing you make is rarely the best. And so on that kind of next image, there's just kind of a select group of iterations of things that I tried. So the very top row is like how to think about shrugging. Like, what does it mean to kind of put your arms up in what became the shrug sign of how to do this, kind of universal symbol of uncertainty. How do you do that? What's the right width? In type design, I have to say, like, I'm not a full-time professional type designer. Like, I really only kind of dabble in this. There are people who are much more skilled at this than I am, but it is obsessive. It is like every little detail of width makes an enormous difference. And so it took quite a long time. This is not the full version of all of these, but even things like the agree mark, which is thinking, well, do you need all the fingers to know that it's a thumbs up? Do you, like, how would you write it? Does it, what would be the most obvious way to kind of move through this? Or of course, you can see the kind of evolution of the cringe and the evolution of the disgust mark in the very bottom, which you can see. I was thinking a lot about the relationship between noses and mouths in frowning. Like that's kind of how that started at the beginning, and kind of how that moved. So if we think also about gesture of writing, was very, very important in these as well, because things like the awkward pause, which is just a long comma, which I
love that one. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad. I thought it was really funny, and then I thought, maybe
we have a slide of that here, the awkward pause.
I don't know if we have this one in the slides, but things like the frustration point, which for me, I thought was both important in its like formal qualities, but also in its gesture, and the fact that it's both like frustrating when you write it, but also it feels really bristling. It feels like it has that level of frustration.
Yes.
So that kind of gesture was important. So those are all like really, those are the big things that I was thinking about as I was designing these. Yeah, that was a long answer, but
no, it's really amazing. Like, this is a really good demonstration of it, that you really connect with the feeling that it conveys. So that's why I say it felt like something that we, it has already. It feels like it's very familiar. You feel connected because you feel it. It conveys that emotion. And how did you come up with this super fresh contemporary color palette that at the same time looks very familiar too, and it seems like, again, something that it's very easy and inviting to connect with?
Thank you. That's, this actually I kind of fell into. This was like a nice happy accident of working on multiple projects. I had just started with a friend and collaborator a series about postcards about income inequality by geographic location in the United States. And we were thinking about these and designing postcards. And in the research that I was doing to design these, we were looking at a lot of mid-century like tinted postcards, hand-tinted postcards from a bit earlier, and then this kind of mid-century color palette. And so I had in my, Adobe Illustrator, had this swatches open from this particular project and thought, oh, I really love these. Could I use these? And then very carefully selected a hue structure that I thought was most appropriate to each of these kind of characters. So it worked out, and there was a little bit of adjusting to make sure that they really fit. But I loved that for the Affecticon, which is for love and affection, like this pink felt really warm, but not too saccharine, or even something like the anticipation point, which is the ligature of an M dash and an exclamation point, could feel like excited, but not like not too much. Like, it doesn't feel over the top. And so even things like the cringe mark, which is in like this like kind of odd orange, which is like both kind of like slightly warning, but also kind of like blushing, like a little bit embarrassed. And so trying to think through what these could be. And then of course, like orange for frustration kind of makes sense. That really feels kind of garish and warning. And so that's how that hue structure was there to kind of help, I think kind of help emotionally in that way. But it just happened to be, it just happened to work out that I had some swatches that I was really excited to have.
Amazing. So where do you see them going? Do you feel like they're coming into the world and we're going to be using them?
I really hope so. So there comes like a point in this project where when I first started it, I was like, okay, I'm fine with it just as speculative design. I'm fine with these just existing, because I truly believe, like in the age, you know, like post-industrial design, like design can be mass produced and that can be great. Design can be a one-off and that can be great. Design can be speculative or critical and that can be great. And it's just as valid as, you know, mass producing, you know, many, many things. And so I was trying to think about, okay, what do these look like as an idea, as discursive design? How do we talk about these? How do we talk about language? And the more that I kind of worked with them and the more I exhibited them, the more I've become really excited that maybe they could really exist. Like maybe these could be a real thing. And so there's kind of two ways to kind of go about this is, you know, my kind of approach right now has been, let's just exhibit them widely, because my hope and is that people will see them and say, oh, yeah, I also want the frustration point. I also want the shrug sign. Why don't we have these? And maybe if we're very, very lucky, they will make their way into conversation. Maybe people will start using them. If you're watching and you think these are cool, please use them. This is my shameless plug, because I want to evolve language. I think our language has to evolve with us. And I think, you know, it should be richer and it should be fuller and it should be able to encapsulate more of what we're doing without having to reuse punctuation, you know, to make, you know, a thing, you know, putting things between asterisks and writing them out. I think that we can actually do this typographically better than we have been. And so that's like something to think about. But then there's also the pragmatics of things like Unicode. Like any new characters will need new Unicode. And so that's something I've been kind of researching because I don't know a ton about, but I'm excited to think about, because if they become, you know, if they start to be used or people, you know, think that they make sense, then that's something that possibly could exist in the world in this way.
That's interesting. So how does the demand start? Is it from the users or you would kind of initiate this process? How does this process work for these characters to come into our everyday use?
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, if I can be really honest. I think it might be a little column A, a little column B. It might be that in presenting them, maybe you gain, you get other people that are on board with you. You get stakeholders. You get people that say, yes, we're on board. We think these are cool. We want to use them. And then I think it has to happen kind of naturally, but also in exhibiting them widely. No one knows they exist if they don't see them. You know, and so I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about them. I'm really absolutely thrilled that they were exhibited, you know, at the Harborfront Center. I'm glad that we have a chance to talk about things like speculative type. I think that that's like thrilling, and not just because it's my work and I really kind of love them, but because I think it's really necessary. And I'm excited about what the future can bring.
Absolutely. So it seems like we have 2 questions from audiences. So we can go over them. Did you drop one because you couldn't decide on the final look? Is there one that haunts your dreams still?
Oh, that's a great question. Very early on, there was like this really wide exclamation point, because I was trying to figure out how to substitute, like when people are really excited, we use the multiple exclamation points, which typographically like absolutely drives me nuts. And so I was thinking, how do we show that kind of excitement? And so I thought, well, what if it's just like a really like big, you know, exclamation point? The whole thing is really stretched out. And that's one that I kind of thought about. And then that was replaced by the anticipation point, because I felt it had that kind of movement without having that kind of redundancy and was still kind of in line, kind of typographically. So that's one that I think evolved into something else. But then since I've made these, I really want a fingers crossed. Like I really want that, you know, like a good luck, because that's like an emoji that we use, but I think would be a really lovely character. So that's what I've been thinking about designing, but haven't gotten to yet.
That's neat. Huh? Yeah. Awesome. And the next question. No more? Okay, great. Answer. Awesome, great. Really lovely to see you and hear closely about your work that captured our attention and intrigued us, and really awesome to be part of this event.
I concur. Thank you so much. It was so great to see you again and to chat with you about
this. Same here.
Wonderful. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, Mia and Anahita.
Thank you.
Great conversation. Yeah, thank you for being a part of both DesignTO, the awards, and this event. Now we're moving into part 3, which is the city, where Anna Rita Moraes, Chair of Design at George Brown College, and Institute Without Boundaries graduate Samira Matin will talk about the exhibition Playroom Toronto, Towards an Ethical, Smart City, Jurors' Choice for Community Wellbeing. Playroom TO showcased the students' research insights and scenarios on ethical smart cities while allowing visitors to learn how an ethical smart city develops with values, technology, and challenges, while also giving them an opportunity to give input on how they think Toronto's major challenges should be solved. Welcome, Anna Rita and Samira.
Thanks, Deborah. Hi, Samira. Thank you kindly for the introduction, Deborah. And hello to everyone who's tuned in. It's always lovely to attend events put on by DesignTO, and it's twice as nice to be invited to participate. I'm proud to be here to represent not only the School of Design at George Brown College, but more specifically, the talented 2019-2020 Interdisciplinary Design Strategy cohort at the Institute Without Boundaries. I'm also very lucky to be joined by Samira Matin, who worked on this exhibition with her cohort. With that, I'd like to start by asking Samira a few questions about the exhibition itself. So we'll start sort of low stakes, Samira, and this isn't being graded, so you can take a step back on that. But what prompted you and your classmates to create the exhibition itself?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think to start, we had to. It was a group project. It was part of our program. But we did have the freedom to determine what that would be, right? So what the exhibition would be, which was both exciting and challenging because we were a group of 13. We came from different backgrounds, academic backgrounds as well. So coming to a consensus took time, but it really yielded a fruitful exhibition.
That's great. What do you think the sort of overall intention of the exhibition itself was?
Yeah, there are definitely a few things we wanted to highlight in our exhibition that became part of our design strategy. We were design strategy students after all. So the first is we wanted to showcase the insights from our research on smart cities. And second is we wanted the exhibition to be interactive and fun. And you can kind of see photos on the screen right now. So these two factors really helped guide the work. By considering many vehicles. So the design of the exhibition, the content we wanted to show, the build of our exhibition, and the overall user experience. I'm really proud of the work we did. We created an impressive exhibition that left people really thinking about smart cities in a unique way. And it wasn't easy to pull off, but I think my classmates and I did a wonderful job. And looking at these photos again reminds me of our work.
Yeah, I think definitely, if for those of you that don't know a lot about the Institute Without Boundaries, we get students from a whole range of different disciplines. Every year we get like a biologist, an anthropologist. And so when you tell them you're going to create an exhibition, most of them panic because it's not something that they're necessarily well versed in. And I think that it's a really great way to build community. And I think, what better way than to do an exhibition that's rooted in the city and sort of representative of the city. You sort of talked a little bit about this idea of engagement and, again, for those that don't know, the exhibition was on the first snowstorm of the new year. And so we had a really snowy night, but we had this amazing turnout. Stakeholders from across the city, folks that were thinking a lot about ethical smart cities, particularly with a lot of the events that were happening in Toronto at that time. But how did you kind of define participation with regards to the exhibition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as a group, so the 13 of us decided that participatory design would be a pillar in our exhibition. We wanted the exhibition to be informative, but one that was really rooted in public engagement. So that meant involving people who came to our exhibition, people who lived in Toronto, who passed through Toronto, who worked in Toronto, in a process of learning about smart cities by focusing on Toronto, the city that, which at the beginning of 2020 was a real focal point in the Smart Cities dialogue. We decided that our ideal audience would be, as you mentioned, people who are interested in smart cities, storytellers like journalists, but also lay people from other students, non-design students, non-designers, but also people like our parents. So many communities and cities around the world were looking to Toronto because they face similar challenges within their communities and cities. So anything from housing to transportation. So as a group, we wondered, was Toronto really ready to become a city in the future? More specifically, we wanted to learn if visitors to our exhibition felt that Toronto prioritized their needs, interests, and values.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's this sort of like idea around, you create an exhibition and then you look quite intently at like what was done, what were you able to accomplish. How were you able to sort of learn some of these things through the exhibition itself?
Yeah, I think that was very multi-level. So we started very high level. We started with our research, and where our research started was what was the history of smart cities, and then even before that, what was the history of cities? What was the transition like from cities to smart cities? And then it became time to define what ethical smart cities mean to us, because that was a new term to us. That was a new term in the dialogue of smart cities. So we really wanted to narrow down the research focus of our exhibition, and we wanted to highlight important Toronto-specific examples as they relate to elements in smart cities, which we determined were values, technology, and challenges. So we had our elements plastered across the exhibition, as you probably saw in some of those photos. So visitors were learning about values, technology, challenges through an interactive game that allowed them to think of solutions to some of Toronto's challenges, so very specific to the city where our exhibition was taking place. And as you mentioned, happened on a snowstorm the first day. We had a great turnout regardless, and Toronto being a focal point in the Smart Cities dialogue because of Sidewalk Lab. So when our visitors entered the space, they grabbed a game card. As they moved through the exhibition, they were learning about the history of cities, the transition from cities to smart cities, and then they were asked to pick a value that was most important to them while learning from Toronto-specific examples. I'll give you an example. So we included the value of privacy, which came a lot during our research on smart cities and different smart city initiatives around the world. And so we provided a Toronto-specific example. We shared that in 2019, the city of Toronto started developing a digital infrastructure plan to ensure that data use and technologies were regulated appropriately. So then as our visitors went through the exhibition, selected their values, they would then move on to picking a technology, which was another element in our definition of smart cities. And more specifically, a technology that could solve a Toronto challenge. So again, we showcased specific Toronto examples with technology. And then they went on to the fun part, which was actually selecting the challenge. And how they did that was by actually spinning that large wheel that you probably saw in some of the photos. And it was amazingly built. It was amazingly designed by folks in our team. Shout out to Celine and Irene, who led the build team for that amazing roulette and wheel. So from there, our visitors were able to so they had a value, they had a technology, and they were spinning for a Toronto-specific challenge. So these challenges were anything from mobility, employment, housing, climate change, you named it. And so all of these challenges impact Toronto in some way, shape, or form. After selecting a value, after selecting a technology, visitors were asked to sketch a solution to the Toronto-specific challenge that they rolled, or that they spun in the wheel, sorry. actually share that with us as students, with other visitors in the exhibit, and actually pin it up on a wall near the end. And people actually did it. I think some of us were worried if people would actually sketch solutions, you know, would they pick a value, would they pick a technology? And they did. We had very interesting solutions that, you know, anything from solar panels to improving the lives of older adults in Toronto, because we wanted to hear from people in the city, and they delivered. We had over 100 submissions all plastered on the wall at the end of our exhibition, and it was a real treat to actually read through all of them.
Yeah, I think that to me was the most memorable part, was getting to actually see the things that people were sort of writing. And it became quite nice to sort of see people's thought process and to sort of correlate what their values were with where they ended up. And I think that that's one of the sort of brilliant things of living in a city, right? Is you do have so many diverse folks with so many different walks of life. And I think having the capacity to share your perspective is really critical here. Thinking again about this idea of participation and how it relates to the city, how can we sort of use these modes of sort of framing our ideas of how to approach the city?
Yeah, so participation is really important, and it was really linked to both the content and design of our exhibition. Like, we wanted to share context about our journey of understanding of smart cities and then ethical smart cities, and then share examples from around the world, because Toronto fits into a global context. But in addition to wanting to educate on the topic of smart cities, we wanted to showcase how Toronto fit into this conversation, and how Toronto could put people at the center of this dialogue around smart cities. Because we actually need ethical smart cities. We don't just need smart cities. And ethical smart cities actually put the needs of the people at the center of their challenges and decision-making process. So at the time, it was really important for us to hear what people in the community thought about solutions to challenges they faced every day. I think public engagement can be really tricky, but it's very important, especially as we were designing solutions to challenges that impacted people, but also larger structures like the environment, political, all of these factors influence it. So it's important to include people with different experiences in your research. So putting extra effort and time was into determining who our audience would be and how we can incorporate them into our exhibit was very important. And there's a lot that we can learn from others. And I think they are the experts of their own experiences, right? And it's incredibly important to understand how people experience and shape cities, because it helps our understanding of smart cities and then ethical smart cities.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one of the things that we talked a lot about last year and was sort of mentioned a lot in the exhibition as well was this idea of, how different municipalities, how different communities, whether Indigenous communities, for example, experience cities and experience the sort of services that are offered by municipalities. And so I think sort of what the exhibition did really well was provide this sort of stepping stone to talk about ethical smart cities in the context of Toronto, but well beyond. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we definitely put intentionality in trying to curate the experiences for people in Toronto. We thought a lot about who our audience would be, but as I mentioned, and as you point out, Anarita, Toronto fits into this larger context about smart cities and then ethical smart cities. So I think we were able to learn a lot through our exhibition. We were able to learn that people in Toronto are actually interested in learning more about their city, and we're intrigued about the concept of ethical smart city, which was a new one. The interactive nature of our exhibition allowed visitors to learn about our elements and the elements in the smart city. And we were able to learn that, for example, people in Toronto valued sustainability. So as we continued our research and continued our project, we were able to understand this value in the context of Toronto, but in the context of other communities around the world. We also learned that technology should be an enabler when it comes to the ethical smart city dialogue. And this was a key takeaway because it really informed the future of our work. After the exhibition, we took insights that we were learning about the elements, so technology, values, challenges, to develop an ethical smart city framework, which really served as a guide for municipalities across Canada on their journey from cities to ethical smart cities, as you mentioned. We shifted from, the person being the smallest unit to the community being the smallest unit, and understanding how values incorporate in that. So putting ethical in the ethical smart city means that solutions to challenges are complex, but they impact different solutions that impact the community. And for us, municipalities really helped develop our understanding of how we could take what we learned at Playroom TO and run with it for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think that sort of stickiness that's enabled by the city is really important. And I think we encountered that quite a bit in the exhibition itself. And you sort of got this variance in solutions and things that people wanted, and you kind of have this push and pull effect in cities.
Yeah.
I have one more question, and it's sort of to talk about where did all of this go? And so, I know that you guys came up with the ESC framework, and it allowed you to sort of contextualize the solution. Can you just talk sort of briefly about that?
Yeah, so the Ethical Smart City Framework was meant to guide municipalities in the process of becoming ethical smart cities. It really was a big and important part of our program after the exhibition. So the framework is a 5-step process to help smart city champions create ethical smart city solutions. The framework is at its core as I mentioned, the most important thing because of this complexity. So it was definitely a team effort to create the Ethical Smart City Framework, but there were a small group of folks who really racked their brains around creating a framework. And I don't know if you've ever created a framework from scratch. It's a lot of work. So I definitely wanted to shout out Roseanne, Hardeep, Irene, and Jordan for giving us the foundation to work on and create something that municipalities across Canada can actually use no matter where they are in their smart cities journey. Something we also relied heavily on was primary research. So we actually interviewed and chatted with smart city champions in municipalities in Canada, from Caledon, Ontario to Kelowna, BC, and others. And the exhibition made it possible for us to understand gaps in our knowledge and how we could use research to help inform the framework, for example. We produce a lot of different artifacts as well. So if you're interested in learning more about our journey, check out the ethicalsmartcity.com, which is a website we use to kind of consolidate all of our work. It includes the Ethical Smart City Framework. It includes more information on the primary research we did with different municipalities. And I wanted to shout out the website teams, Celine, Hardeep, Amanda, Jordan, Natasha, and Tanya, and our WordPress developer for creating that. It is a resource that municipalities can tap into, that folks who are joining us today interested in learning more can tap into as well. And if you're a municipality interested in learning more about your ethical smart city journey or the ethical smart city journey, feel free to download the Ethical Smart City Framework on that website. We'll share a link in the chat later today. And lastly, there is a publication that can also be, if you're interested in learning more, please check out our publication where we highlight more on the framework, Ethical Smart City Framework, and the Ethical Smart City Toolkit. And shout out to Roseanne, Aduni, Andrea, and Hardeep for really working on that. And I think so there, as a group project, we had a lot of artifacts. So lastly, I wanted to share just one more thing. We created an online event, actually, very similar to this. It was a couple of hours long where we shared our work. We shared our learnings from, first semester Playroom TO and leading on after we went into quarantine and we're working remotely. And it can also be accessed on that website. And so shout out to Maddie and Irene for guiding us through that. It was tough. It happened in the middle of the pandemic, not something we anticipated, and Max for the videos that really distilled our process. So you probably guessed, at least in the last few minutes, the 13 of us did a lot of important work after Playroom TO, but as students in Toronto, it was vitally important that people within the city, traveling in the city, working in the city, living in the city, played a vital role in our quest to learn about ethical smart cities. So thank you for listening.
That's great. Thanks, Samira. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who participated. I want to thank you to the faculty, and I want to say thank you for DesignTO for having us as well. It was really lovely to be part of last year's program of activity and to be included in tonight's award show as well. I think there might be one more question from the chat. So what can we learn from Google's failed attempt at a smart city in Toronto? So I'll defer to Samira here. She probably has a lot of insights, and I think probably quite a bit around public engagement and procurement. And yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you, Chris. I think, yeah, when we were working on the Playroom TO event, it was a totally different time, right? Sidewalk Labs was still happening in the city of Toronto. It was still definitely, there was a debate around it, but it was still very much in people's purview. I feel like one thing we really learned in tackling smart cities and the ethical smart city is the importance of public engagement, the importance of actually including people who live in, travel in, work in cities to participate in the decision-making process. We really focused on communities. We really focused on municipalities across the country to learn about how they incorporated the needs of their people in their solutions, and that people and communities, more so communities, need to be at the center of smart city conversations. It isn't just about technology. Technology is an enabler to help us solve complex challenges, but people and communities are really at the center of this. So if anything, something we definitely learned is the importance of public engagement, for sure, the importance that technology is and should be used as an enabler, and really understanding the needs of your community. Maybe it's the housing crisis, maybe it's a transportation issue, maybe it's climate change, maybe it's all three. So how do you involve people in the process of actually understanding how they fit into that dialogue, and how municipalities, how community members, how the private sector, how just, you know, the lay person, the everyday person can actually work on helping create solutions to challenges that actually impact them. That was our biggest learning. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Samira. So I just wanted to say thank you again, and it's lovely to chat about the exhibition. I think, you know, we're all sort of missing that interactive space.
Totally. Yeah.
But yeah, it was lovely, and it's lovely to think back on being able to actually see each other face to face. And I'm glad that you folks had that opportunity. I'll hand it back to Deborah now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna Rita and Samira, and to the rest of our speakers and interviewers, as well as a big thank you to Herman Miller for their ongoing support of the DesignTO Awards, and to the DesignTO team, especially Robin Wilcox and Michael Magis, who are working behind the scenes tonight. And I want to thank the audience, you, for joining us. Programs like these are made possible through your support. So please consider joining DesignTO's members community. We have new benefits, tiers, and year-round programming like this available starting next month and onward. Look out for announcements soon, and more information is available at designto.org/member. Have a good night.